welcome to the Art of Being Human. As you know, we're dealing with a serious pandemic, and what I'm doing is I'm going through the basics in terms of depression, anxiety, phobias, grief, bereavement, suicidology, all of those things. And the reason I'm doing it is the fact that all of those things are at a higher level now that the pandemic has hit. Many people have lost loved ones, so they're grieving over that. Many people have lost their jobs, and so they're in a panic over that. So there's a lot of mental health stresses at this time. So I want to go back to the basics and discuss all of those things. Now, I think probably another thing that's going on is that if you have unresolved issues, then the pandemic is bringing them back up. Supposing a few years ago, or maybe many years ago, you suffered from depression or you suffered from anxiety, and the root causes of that weren't ever resolved at that time. Either you didn't get the therapy you needed, or you got it but you passed it by somehow, or you tried to push the problem into a corner so you didn't have to deal with it. And because it was unresolved, whatever it could be almost anything, that the pandemic is bringing it back up. You know, one of the interesting things about midlife crisis, and I have done shows on the midlife crisis, which can occur anywhere from age 35 on, although usually it's not quite that early. Usually it's at 40 or 50 on. What happens is that every stage of development that you go through, from infancy through elderly age, there are problems associated and challenges associated with every type of development, every stage of development. You know, you have your childhood, early, middle, and late childhood, young adulthood, and then adulthood, and then you have the middle age time where you have some insecurities because of menopause or because of midlife crisis, and then you have the elderly age. All of these life cycles, all of these life things are certain dimensions, there's certain sections, there's certain stages of development, and they all have their challenges. Those challenges need to be resolved at the age that you hit them. You know, a child that's in late childhood has certain challenges. They need to fix them then. They need to work through them then. Because what happens if you don't? Then what happens when you get to midlife, all of the challenges of all of the stages of development that were not resolved come back to haunt you, and that can make for a very difficult midlife crisis. So that's what you have to remember. You have to remember that what has not been resolved in the past comes back to haunt you in the present. And if you're not aware of what it is, it may come out sideways. It may be a major psychological issue, but it's not resolved, so it causes some physical problems. It just comes out. All the emotions that you have got to be expressed. We don't often think about that, but we have to express our emotions. And if we don't express them in a creative, healthy way, then the body takes the hit. You get ulcers, you get migraines. Now, not all of those conditions are all psychological. There are real reasons, physical reasons for you to have ulcers and headaches and all of that. But it certainly doesn't make it any easier if you haven't resolved the crises that you've gone through in a normal developmental stage, and it hits you, but it also triggers what's going on now, also triggers it to come back. So one of the reasons for my going through it is some of the intensity of what people are going through are due to problems that they've not resolved, and they're coming back to haunt them. And you put the problems of the pandemic on top of that, then you can have some real serious problems in terms of anxiety and depression, grief and bereavement, and even suicidology. So I want to tackle that. Remember that all emotions are natural. Don't class them as good or bad. They're there. We all experience them. But some are going to be healthier than others. Some you're going to enjoy more than others. Some you're going to have a difficult time with. So we see the past through our pain. We look at the past through the pain that has not yet been resolved. If you are suffering from some kind of anxiety and depression, and it seems really, really intense, there's a good chance that you're living through some past pain that has not been resolved. If you have a sense of guilt, and it's just a serious guilt, and you can't get it off your mind, and it's self-worth, and what am I worth, and I have a bad self-concept, and how come, and all of that is serious, there's a good chance that years ago you had something like that, and it was not resolved, and it's coming back. It's like it has to be recognized. Now, my mother had a statement, and I think it's true, and I learned a lot from my mother, but she said, if you are suffering from something like that, acknowledge it. If you acknowledge your emotions, then the intensity of the emotions gets lessened. It's not as strong. If you can say, oh yes, this is a bad day, I'm suffering from depression today, then, and you acknowledge that. You don't have to acknowledge it to everybody, but if you acknowledge it to yourself, the chances are you're not going to be quite so suffering because you've let the body know that you recognize it. It's like what's going on in the body has to be recognized. It has to be acknowledged. If you don't acknowledge it, then the suffering gets more intense. People will walk up and say, well, I've told myself I'm not going to be nervous today, I'm not going to be anxious today, I'm not going to have depression today, I'm just not going to deal with it. And as a result of that, it comes on stronger and stronger and stronger because they have not acknowledged what their body is trying to tell them. If you can acknowledge what your body is trying to tell them, the acknowledgement itself is enough to calm some of the symptoms down. So if you don't believe me, just try it sometime. You know, there is a new book out. I mentioned it once before. I didn't bring it in today, but maybe I will in another 2 or 3 sessions. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. A lot of us, and there's a premise, I don't agree with everything the book says, but it's a very, very good book when it deals with trauma. And it's basically how to handle trauma. And what it points out is that the body, with the symptoms that you have, is trying to get your attention. It's trying to let you know what's wrong. It's trying to communicate with you. And if you acknowledge that and deal with that, then the intensity of the symptoms does go down quite a bit. You don't have to feel quite as nervous if you acknowledge this is a nervous day. But if you try to fight against it, oh, I'm nervous, but I'm not going to be. I'm not going to allow myself to be nervous. I'm just not going to allow myself to be nervous. I'm nervous all the time. I won't put up with it any longer. You've almost invited it to come. You know, if a child comes to you and they're crying because they've scunned their knee and they're in some pain with it, if you just say, oh, it's just a skinned knee, it's all right, then you're not going to help them much. But if you can be more compassionate, this is a skinned knee and it's going to hurt some, but we're going to make it better. And you bandage it up, but you help the child to acknowledge it, that it doesn't hurt so much. It actually does work. It's an interesting thing to try. So I want to just go on with this. The mind can't tell the difference between a real and an imagined thing. I don't know how many times I've said it, but it's so important. If you are in the throes of an anxiety attack, what can you do? Well, you're thinking probably about the worst possible thing that can happen. You're anxious and you're nervous about something that's come up, something that you're remembering, something that you're going to do. And it's just there, and the anxiety is there. Then the best thing you can do is to acknowledge it. It's okay. I am suffering from this. It's come up. It wants to be acknowledged. It wants to be recognized for what it is. And when you do that, some of the anxiety disappears. Now, I think it's a case of the body trying to let you realize what's going on. The premise of that book, The Body Keeps the Score, there are some things I'm not sure about in the book, but it is a very good book. And that one thing it does say, for people who have hallucinations, you know, for schizophrenics and so forth, maybe their hallucinations are just a reflection of maybe some things that they've had in the past, some problems they've had in the past, and it's seeking recognition. It doesn't put it in that kind of way. This is my way of paraphrasing what the book said. Maybe something, if a person is having hallucination, that the body is remembering something from the past. And we treat it like a hallucination because it's a psychotic event and it needs medication and all of that. But maybe deep down in, beyond that, maybe there's something the body's remembering and it's trying to kind of communicate with the person what that is. Now, you can look at it either way. In psychosis, you do get hallucinations, you do get delusions. I worked with a student once when I first moved to be a college professor, and for some reason, he decided that I was the key to his getting well. And I had to take him to the dean's office. We had to have a meeting because his behavior just was inappropriate. For one thing, what he did, and I'll tell you what he did, it made me a little nervous at the time, but he was psychotic. He gave me a razor blade. He says, open your hand, and this is after a class. I open my hand, he puts a razor blade in, and he says, this is what I want you to defend yourself with when I come to kill you. Now, how many people get that in daily life? So I went to the dean with it. We had a meeting with him, and he's looking at curtains, and he says, don't you see all those golden bugs crawling up the windowsill and the window and the curtains? There's a lot of yellow golden bugs. Well, there weren't any yellow. He was having hallucination. He eventually had to be hospitalized. And he was treated, and when they let him out, the first thing he did was come to get me. He went right on the campus. We had a restraining order. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere close to me, but he came. So another professor came in. This is a true story. I'm not making it up. It's a horror story, but it is a true story. One of the other professors in the building where I was teaching came rushing in and grabbed me. He says, come with me. And I went with him, and they put me in another room, an empty room. It was a classroom right beside my office. And then they closed the door on me, and they stood guard. They stood guard outside the door because he had come to get me, you know, and he knew where my office was. And so finally the police were called. He was taken out. He got away from the police. There was some mountains behind the college campus. They let me out, and they said, he's gone up in the mountains. We got to get him. I went up with the police on that top of that little mountain. It was like a really large hill, to try to find him. Well, he wasn't there anymore. He had gone down to a major highway and decided that he could not have me, he would die. And so he was laying out prone on a highway, and then they took him and put him back in the mental hospital. So things like that, if their biochemistry, if a schizophrenic or whatever kind of illness a person has is really, really off, then they have to medicate them, they have to hospitalize them, they have to treat them. But there are people who have a lot of stresses, and they may have a momentary flash of something that they're seeing, and it may not be there, but what is their mind trying to tell them? You know, I've had a lot of experiences as a college professor, and most of them were very good, but occasionally somebody would come and they were very disturbed and they needed treatment, they needed help. If you find yourself and you don't seem to be normal even to you, then it's important that you get the help that you need. Any emotion that you feel is normal and natural as a general rule, and any emotion that you feel needs to be expressed. expressed. If you don't express the emotions that you feel, then they can get turned inward on yourself. A lot of grief and depression is anger turned inward. It hasn't been resolved, and so you don't want to deal with it. You don't want to deal with your own anger. It just doesn't seem appropriate. You're upset about it, and you can turn that anger inward to yourself. And if it gets turned inward in the body and not expressed and not dealt with, then you can have a serious depression. Now, I view anxiety and depression as two different conditions, but there's no doubt about it. Some people suffer from both, and one can, under certain conditions, lead to another. So mental health is important. But as getting back to this, I don't want to get too far afield. The mind does not know the difference between a real and an imagined thing. Whatever you are thinking, whatever you are feeling, it feels to you like it's real. And that can become a reality. Now, in one of the shows that I did, I think maybe the last one, I showed a chart, and I showed how you get symptoms, and then when your symptoms get great enough, you go to a counselor or you go to somebody that'll help you to get rid of the symptoms. You don't necessarily know what the cause is. And I kept repeating in that show, there's no such thing as a symptom without a cause, and that's true. There is no such thing as a symptom without a cause. And you don't necessarily know what the cause is, and the cause may be completely different than what you think it is. Sometimes you can remember events that are difficult. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can remember part of them. You can remember part of what happened, but not all of what happened. And as a result of that, you suffer the consequences of not getting released from that. But counseling can help. Any kind of medical intervention can help. But remember, you don't know the difference. If you are anxious, you might be anxious to a level that's at a depth that it's caused not just by a present situation, but a situation that you've that you have come up against before that hasn't truly been resolved. And so that is raising its head for recognition and to be treated, and it will haunt you off and on until you get it taken care of. I think a lot of people's midlife crisis, which is serious, midlife crises, is because when they were young adults, they had issues. When they were teenagers, they had issues. And those issues, which would be normal for those age periods, were not resolved satisfactorily, so they come back. So you get another crisis, which may be age-related and perfectly normal for that age, but it brings up everything else before you that hasn't been resolved. Things need to be resolved when they come up. So you need to be able to express that which is in you. You need to be able to express your emotions. You need to be able to do it in a creative way. And you need to have all of that resolved. Then you go on in the next stage, and the next stage isn't so difficult because it's not bringing up something before that wasn't resolved. That's just something for you to think about. We react emotionally to what's in our brain. And what happens is that whatever we're thinking, whatever we're feeling, that becomes our reality, and that becomes our truth. And we start believing that. So we need release from that. It will help you if you're anxious, if you realize that not all of the things that you're feeling may be accurate. The brain has a way of embellishing things. If you're very, very anxious and it doesn't seem like you're in a situation that would cause as much anxiety as you're suffering from, you're having real anxiety attacks, then it may well be that it's something in the past that you're still living through, and you're living your past pain. Now, that's not the scientific word for it, but at any rate, I use that because I think it's a term that I use that I think people will understand. You can be living your past pain, but it's bringing back up, whether you realize it or not, or whether you can remember it or not. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. It brings up all all those things that have been unresolved. And so you're likely to remember part of them, but probably not all of them, some which you may not remember at all. And it's just a case of when you remember or your brain gets wind of something that's gone on and is similar to what you've gone through before, it's almost like a flashback, and you can suffer miserably. Now you got to remember, and I know we're getting close to the end of time, but I just want to show you this poster on the brain. I wasn't going to get to it this soon, but I may as well do it now. This is just my sketch of a human brain. And this is the brain itself. This is the skull. This here is the prefrontal cortex. What do you do in the prefrontal cortex? You think, you reason, you do normal mental things. You decide, you make decisions. I decide what I'm going to wear. I decide whether I'm going to go shopping. I decide this, I decide that. I think about things, I resolve things. It's just normal mental functioning. But when I start to remember something, or something happens that reminds me of something, I say me, but I'm really meaning everybody, then the emotions get stored in the amygdala. The amygdala is a small area. It's deeper in the brain, and it stores emotions. So when you think about something that's happened to the past, you not only think about it with the cerebral cortex, so you remember it, or parts of it, but you trigger what you suffered in the amygdala. In other words, the emotions that you suffered at that time are the emotions that are going to come up. It's like it's been reborn. It's like it has a life of its own. So therefore, something reminds me of a horrible thing that happened to me in the past, and all of a sudden, not only do I remember the event, but I remember the emotions that went with the event. And in doing so, I go through that same emotional experience as I did before, just as strongly as I did before. It's like it has a life of its own. I can't get rid of it. Anytime something reminds me of an event that was traumatic for me, the amygdala shares the emotions that I went through at the time. Now, I may not remember exactly what it was. I may remember only a part of what it was. If I don't remember what it was, I can still get those emotions because something that you thought about or something that you did triggered it. And even if you don't know what it was, you're getting the emotions from it. So the emotions are coming out. And so that's where you're getting it. And the problem with anxiety is if you've been traumatized, this happens over and over again. It's almost like you can't get rid of it. It's the bad shadow that follows you everywhere. You think of something, suddenly the emotions come. Or sometimes they seem to come out of the blue and you don't know where they come. But there's no such thing as a symptom without a cause. And so therefore something is behind it somewhere. And if you can't remember it, you're still going to get the emotions of it. So when you get to the therapist's office, what do you want to do? Help me stop the emotions. Help me stop my symptoms. You don't know what the cause is, but you know what your symptoms are, and they're coming straight from here. And so what a therapist has to do is to find out what caused it to begin with. What was that event? And it may not have been one event. It may have been a series of events. Supposing you were abused, say you had sexual abuse from an uncle or an aunt or something, from ages 10 through 14, well, it go right back there. You might not remember much of it. I don't think you have to remember everything, but you have to remember a pattern of things. When you remember a pattern of things, you bring up enough so a therapist can work with it. Then you can look at it from a different point of view and you can get help. If you're stuck and you're having anxiety all the time, there are ways to deal with it. There are ways to heal it. But I'm not going to be a therapist over television. That's not my function. But I can point you in the right direction to get help and give you some hints as to what might be going on. So I see my time is getting less than I'd like it to be, so I'm going to close it here, and we are going to continue with this next time. Please join me then.